Hello. Actually, I rehearsed my Filipino. Mayong hapon. Greetings. Hello. And thank you, Malcolm, for inviting me along. It's been, we're just saying how amazing it has been so far, so diverse, so thoughtful, so provoking about different approaches, questions about digital ways of making, questions about craft, questions about the value of maintaining these heritages. My talk is going to, again, be a little different because I'm talking about a community that actually has no heritage of making at all. The perspective is different, but I'm just going to show you a few slides about my work because maybe it puts in the context of, similar again to Plymouth, University of Brighton, where I teach, is very much, on the course I teach, 3D design and craft, is very much about thinking through making. Even the design end of the program is, the default position is to think how the making can inform your decisions. But as lecturers, we're also researchers, and it's a very important part of, I think, both Plymouth and Brighton, the way we operate. It's not fundamentally all about teaching, it's about sharing and collaborating, and I think hopefully you'll see that through the whole project here. But my own interest, and I suppose again that's why I've been invited here, why I've been involved in the projects that I have, are to do with materiality and material narratives. And I'm particularly interested in found materials, and that connects with Cameron's talk about craft and risk and chance finds, the use of materials that exist already. The thought that this, for some people, I think I heard some people a little gasping a bit when a previous speaker was saying plastic is great. Actually, plastic is an amazing material. Polymers are incredible materials. The material composition of them, the sort of the journey of them from out of the ground to processing, very exotic in many ways, and not just be discarded essentially. So this is a project where I'm considering polymer as a material. People talked before about the Anthropocene, this another layer of sort of human activity. And unlike archaeology, it has its own codes that we can read from that maybe we want to exploit. And I'm interested in harvesting materials. Again, this comes from some thoughts about what's around us. What have we got to work with if we're not importing, and using fuel to bring materials around the world? What have I got to hand? One of the materials I have to hand is stuff in my street. So where my studio is, I forage for materials that I can work with. And that's also is interesting from the serendipity point of view. What is to hand today? Well, this thing happened to be outside, broken toy. I shredded it into smaller parts, turned it into glue gun sticks, and used it to join vessels together. So the colours are what they happen to be because of what's available on the day, and that is related to the community. What's the community buying and disposing of? And it also comes into these kinds of forms using heat press techniques, using thermoforming of the polymers. And this is another strand of what I'm interested in, and this is, in a sense, why I've been involved in the project that I'm going to talk about, because wood is one of my particular interests as a material. This is a piece that I exhibited with the Crafts Council a number of years ago, and it's made of a composite of found materials, found wood. This is actually beer cans that I found on the side of the road. I'm interested in, again, the kind of foraging from the roadside verge. These are car crash polymers, like the example, it was a wing mirror from a car. Materials that I have available. I'm not interested in people giving me things. I'm interested in the chance finds and the curiosity of deciding to pick up certain things and use certain things. I don't want to go too much into text, but this is to remind myself that the project that I'm speaking of isn't entirely about my work. It is a collaboration between Nick Gant, who I think some of you will know already for his involvement with Making Futures and Community 21, Ryan Woodard, who's a senior lecturer in the School of Environment, Tanya Dean, who's a co-lecturer of mine in School of Art, and Anthea Rousseau, who runs the Dreamcatcher Foundation in South Africa. And Nick was very keen that I included at least a bit of the text at the top, which was that globally, some 2 billion people do not have access to waste collection and 3 billion do not have access to controlled waste disposal. many communities are suffering as a consequence, and waste is now seen as a development problem. Materialists think of this valorization more to do with the fact that it's a material, how can you use that material again? At the university, we are interested in another kind of valorization also, that are there other qualities, are there other narratives that we can bring into the materials that we can reuse and advance their use of. This is the typical model. I'm sure you're very familiar with it. Previous speakers have talked about, Thomas Diaz talked about the linear model. I'm sure you're familiar with this, the idea that extraction, transportation, manufacturing, and in many cases that the manufacturers are not dealing with their waste. We're not necessarily dealing cleverly with our waste. And this is what we're interested in, I suppose, in many ways. What else can happen at that end here? Rosie was saying we're seeing a lot of ellipse pictures of diagrams, but these are ellipse because the pictures are stretched. This is a round one. But again, the circular economy is something that I'm sure you're very familiar with. In this case, the diagram that comes from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is describing the more pragmatic version of the model, that the cradle version. How do we make sure that the people who dig out the materials, work with the materials, are also thinking about the end life or the continued use of the materials? But we are going to add to that in this talk. Again, these images actually come from a slideshow that some of you may have seen from Nick Gant talking in other conferences. But our interest in this project is not how can we be industrialists, how can we work with materials at that scale, but how can we work with materials and influence people to make change at more local levels? How can we build a kind of manufacturing base, in a sense of hives? And again, it's been talked about many times, how can we connect those hives? So it's not just simply having maybe some influence in one place, but we can have a greater influence if we connect up and share practice. This is, again, actually very much indebted to Nick for lending me these slides. Our model, we're very interested in, again, looking back to the slides I showed you earlier, the use of waste. The university students are very interested, of course, in sustainable issues and the materials that are available to us, including this enormous resource of waste. But not simply about waste in a maybe a sort of more physics or chemistry terms, but again, in terms of the narratives, in terms of the needs or the values in relation to the context. And how do we not simply do this ourselves in the University of Brighton, but how do we share? And how do, are there routes to sharing? And some of the experiments we've done with this project are to do with struggling with, again, as Cameron was mentioning, the sort of ambiguity of coming to conferences like this, but actually, the amount of air miles that we've used up in these journeys. Are there other routes to getting involved in development projects? So specifically, the project that I'm talking about is based in the Western Cape, South Africa, invited by the Dreamcatcher Foundation, initially because they have a problem with waste. This was one of the questions in the conference about, can we change patterns of production and consumption? Actually, in the community I'm going to talk about, there is no production, there is no manufacturing, there is no making really, other than producing waste. And therefore, and not really thinking what's going to happen to that waste afterwards. So here is the community of Melkhoek-Fontein. It's formally about 2,500 Cape-coloured, which means a mixed community with different origins in terms of their identity, that essentially services a white resort, Still Bay. Their work is dependent on being employed here mostly in the services, in cleaning houses, in working in shops, low wages, if they can get wages at all. Essentially, the project that we got involved in is to go beyond the fact that how do you train or educate people to think more about how they can be sustainable with their waste management, but what about the resource of waste itself? Is there something that can be done? Because what these people in the community want is some kind of living. For most people, there's almost no living. The formal population of 2,500 is probably really more like 5,000, because a lot of people live in these sort of shacks, these illegal settlements around the edge of the community with no sanitation, with no money, essentially. So from the University of Brighton, could we bring in some ideas of how the waste could be transferred into profit? And this is the waste dump, the local waste dump. So you can see where the problem is. Partly it's commercial waste dumped from the resort. Shouldn't be dumped here, but it is dumped here because there isn't a lot of control on it. But there's a real mix of materials in this soup. So the starting point for us was more of a theoretical one. It was a university student project, a sort of real-life project, but based at the University of Brighton. Could the students come up with ideas for products that could be made locally for the community to make their own living? But as I say, the peculiarity of this project, and unlike the other projects that have been talked about, is that there is no evidence of making there. There's no tradition of making. There's nothing to draw upon to say, in the way that other people have spoken here, that there is a heritage of weaving or of carving. The only evidence you see of making is that people try and construct their own dwelling out of what is to hand. And you can see craft in that, but quite often it's just contingent, is what is there and what have I got to nail it onto the wall with? So the quality of making is generally quite low, and that's just because of what is available. So our interest here was not only could we think of products that could bring value to the community, in monetary value, but are there things that they could practically make, which was quite problematic. I mean, it was particularly problematic, of course, because we weren't there in South Africa. We were working with an intermediary, a foundation, who were in the community, had been in the community for many years, so they were like the kind of consultant to us. So one of the sort of initiatives in the community is called Cook Up with Kamamas. People can come to Melkfontein and learn cookery skills from local people, which is, of course, a craft in itself. So some of the ideas from the students were about spoons for ladles, spoons that could be souvenirs. So again, these were sort of theoretical projects because they weren't on the basis of understanding, well, what can actually the community members do? What are their capabilities in craft? I mean, actually, we should say that there was nothing there to say, oh, well, okay, they make that already, so therefore they should be able to make these. We were just thinking, well, maybe we can teach the community to make some of these products. This was an apron, again, connected with the Cook Up with Kamamas. This was actually a proposal from one of the staff team using a heat press, and someone mentioned earlier that in their community project they're using a heat press. It's like a T-shirt press, or it's called a clam press. I'll show you one later on. It's a really simple piece of equipment. That can be very versatile and on the table. I'm very happy afterwards to explain any of the making that you might be interested in. There are products that were made entirely with this one piece of equipment. And this is a school bag, and this relates to the sort of matrix that Nick had shown in that graphic. The need and the conversations at the beginning with the community were, what are your needs apart from having some kind of income? School children go to school with no bags. The books get wet. So could we design something that could be used locally, could be used by the children in the community, but of course also could be sold, maybe different levels of complexity of those products. This was something that I developed, and again, all the sort of processes are showed on the table, using PET bottles, stripping them into ribbons, and then turning them into bristles. As I say, this is something that I developed in the UK, thinking, well, maybe these are the kind of skills that can be acquired. And the materials that we had to work with are the waste plastic, but the other material was acacia cyclops. I forgot to mention this, that all around the community is a kind of bush which has been brought in to the Western Cape from from Australia, and has taken over the indigenous plants. So it's being cut down, being burnt. So my connection here was more to do with using how could this wood, this rhododendron-like species of wood, be used? So the examples there, you can see it. They're not big pieces of wood. They're mostly quite twig-like. And this is our first experiment. Well, how can we kind of make this conversation here with the local people, rather than saying, here is the stuff that you're going to make, but what do you think of these things? What do you think of the potential of you making these things? What do you think is right or wrong with these things? So this was a Skype conversation or a Skype review of the project with the community workers. And this was one of the students demonstrating to people in the community via Skype how to make one of her products. And again, you know, with the feedback of, is this possible, is this not possible? Because at this point it was unknown. We got fantastic funding from the British Council, the DICE funding, to push this project further. So rather than it being simply some kind of an exercise remotely, I was lucky enough to go to South Africa with a colleague and actually see on the ground. And from my point of view, it wasn't how can I explain to people how to do things, but how could I learn myself and advance my own teaching practice. So I very much thought that this was a collaborative exercise. It wasn't, because I had no experience of working in a community like this. So, you know, I was very worried up front that what was I doing? What knowledge was I able to impart to this community? This is a very typical quote that, you know, loads of different versions of it. Waste is just a resource in the wrong place. But actually, from the point of view of this community, it was in the right place because it's free stuff. You know, they are producing waste with the best intentions. We will reduce that impact because this is Ryan, who's an expert in waste management from the university, discussing this issue. But there will always be waste. So it's a free material. It's a free material for a community that have nothing else there. They have the acacia being cut down typically for firewood, but they also have this waste polymer. So could we take advantage of it? And culturally, could we also change a mindset that could they think that the stuff made of waste had value beyond simply that it can be sold? You know, would they stand up for it? Did they feel dignified in producing it? The DICE funding was given for developing entrepreneurs in the community. And we divided up this sense of being entrepreneurs, not simply on the basis that could people make things, but could they be involved in other ways in the project. So these were collecting waste materials, and it wasn't about going to the dump, it was about going around the community and sorting and cleaning waste. At the beginning, you know, this seemed like the short straw, but they decided that they were the waste management team. And through the way, you know, this project was approached by the University of Brighton and Dreamcatcher, they felt a sense of ownership of this task and a sense of pride in their job. So this is Anthea talking about the business side. So the entrepreneurial training isn't simply, you know, how do we make stuff, but how do we sell stuff? How do we persuade or encourage other people to be interested in the project? A spin-off of this was that the people involved in the project had certification for training in different ways, which of course has currency beyond whether you pursue this craft work. You know, after the event, we went with the community to visit the local museum. Most of them had never been there, to see, are there some things that we can draw upon to, you know, to bring into these projects that, again, have that meaning, have that sense of context. And you'll see that some of the products have benefited from that. This is the Home Office. This is where we developed a workshop. This wasn't DICE funded. This was funded by a parallel project, but the wood workshop was where I was essentially based, and this is me talking with some members of the craft team about the acacia and how to store it, how to use it. This is me working with a lathe. It's quite a sophisticated piece of equipment, yet tricky. You know, using a lathe, somebody limited dexterity because of, you know, the sort of lifestyle that some of the members of the community had in the past. How could this person use a lathe? How could they develop the skills to make something that's worth selling? You know, that has value in it being sold. Some members of the community became entrepreneurs because they became workshop managers. That was their skill. This is the heat press. These are people using the waste plastics to develop sheet materials with this heat press that could then be formed into bowls. This is an individual who started developing their own aesthetic, their own artistic skill, which again, there was no evidence of that really amongst the community. It's a sort of, supposed leisure activity when you can do nothing other than strive for money. But we could see that from the beginning of giving people kind of examples of things that could be made, tests to be made, that everything had the possibility to be more than a standard. So again, there are examples on the table where the makers customized, developed their own forms. This person was one of the entrepreneurs, but he was never going to be an independent maker. But what we discovered through the project, starting from the point of view that is this about making money from craft, actually it's also about involving the community, giving people a sense of self-worth in a community where maybe they don't. An elder maybe doesn't have that sense of self-worth. So he turned up all the time because he just felt it was good for him to be involved in something as a maker. This is where we saw that, again, the makers developed their own techniques, their own mark-making techniques, which wasn't the things that we'd brought along with us and said, well, here are some things that you could possibly do. Here are some things that I'd never thought were doable in terms of applying pigments. Again, these are some of the examples of things on the table, ways of using the waste polymer to make wheels for cars. These are bottle tops that were heated up in a very low-tech process. And again, some images of the sense of sort of self-worth from the students making things that they were then able to sell at the culmination of the DICE project, which was the Christmas craft market. So the last couple of slides, where we opened this up to the community in Stilby, the people with the money in their pockets, and the tourists that come at Christmas time to Melkrootfond, to Stilby, because it's their summer. Very well received, because exactly the thing that we were hoping for. The visitors were saying, this is authentic. It's not like the stuff that was sold in Stilby or the stuff that you might find in Cape Town or Johannesburg. It's made locally with local materials. So it was very well received by visitors who kept coming back with their friends because they wanted to get an experience, a gift from Western Cape, which actually had some value and some meaning. And just a couple of slides to say that this scene was almost unheard of before, that there would be this negotiation where normally it's a shopkeeper. There would be no sense of this sort of collaboration between somebody from the Still Bay and somebody here, negotiating about creative ideas. Lots of things came out from it which we weren't expecting. We've added to this circular economy because we realized, and this wasn't what we knew at the beginning, that the making developed health and well-being. Whether it developed somebody's personal income or not, it developed their health and well-being, it educated them, it developed a sense of community amongst people who maybe felt very fragmented and not necessarily took ownership of it. So there were other things that came from the project apart from the possibility that people could get out of their poverty. And finally, these were the research questions that we brought to the conference. What is the role of remaking in exposing social, economic, and environmental opportunities? So again, the making was much more than could people make a living, but could they socially integrate? Could they have a respect for their environment? Could they have an identity or a status in their community, the fact that they're actually doing something which is profitable and actually making things which for other people they thought, did you make that? That just seems impossible. Methods of supporting it, this is an ongoing thing, and we saw it here, the difficulties that you can have with the Skype, with the remote communication. We're still thinking, are there ways of making these collaborations which are not simply flying people to South Africa? And finally, is it one-way traffic? Were we doing something that was entirely about thinking we're doing good for somebody else? But no, we didn't think that. And even more so as the project went on, we felt that what we were doing was mutually beneficial. Mutually beneficial, certainly for myself, in terms of my teaching and my understanding of how to work with students, doesn't matter where they are. So, yeah, that's my talk. Thank you very much.